Hello, everyone. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm the Economic Inclusion Fellow at Center State CEO, and I'll be moderating tonight's speaker series event. Before we get started, I would like to say thank you to our sponsor, JP Morgan Chase, for sponsoring this event and all of the tech and culture programming that we put together here at Center State. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our amazing speaker, Erin McKinney. Today, Erin is going to talk to us a little bit about her passion around social impact, equitable entrepreneurship, and inclusive innovation. And I also like to take the time to read you all her amazing bio. So let me see. Erin has a successful track record as an entrepreneur, policy advisor, leader, diversity and inclusion expert, and media maven. She co-founded the global membership organization, Black Female Founder, and previously served as managing partner of inclusion for Jumpstart Inc. and as Washington, D.C. Senior Advisor on Innovation and Entrepreneurship in the Executive Office of the Mayor. Erin has held executive leadership roles with several national nonprofits, including the National Association of Multicultural Digital Entrepreneurs, the National Diversity Council, and the Maynard Institute. She serves as an advisor and mentor to startups, incubators, and accelerator programs as a member of Pipeline Angels and the advisory committee of Hellcoin Incubator. Erin, I don't know if I pronounced that right. She is Okay, thank you. She is the founding member of the Black Innovation Alliance and serves as a board director for Greater Twin Cities United Way and Tubman Center. Erin has an MA in Mass Communication and Media Studies from Howard University, where she is currently pursuing her PhD within the Technology, Policy, and Society program. Erin, you've done a lot. It's amazing. Is there anything that you wanted to say to the group before we get started?
Well, just that I'm really excited to be here, and thank you, Marcus. And also, Marcus is pretty amazing himself. And so I'm really honored that he's leading this fireside chat.
Thank you, Erin. Appreciate it. So just to get started, can you tell us a little bit why you decided to, become an entrepreneur or work with entrepreneurs?
Well, first, the reason I started to become an entrepreneur is just, it's much like the kids movie Robots. I don't know if anyone has kids and they ever saw that movie, but there's a line in there that talks about see a need, fill a need. And I just would always see needs and want to fill those needs and not feel like anyone was doing anything about them. So I think that just initial connection and passion, but then becoming an advocate for entrepreneurs really I just saw so many systems that were broken and not enough resources going to entrepreneurs, especially women and minorities. So, for me, there was a time when I was living in the Bay Area in the mid 2000s. I was recently divorced. I had been laid off from several companies that just during the recession. But I'd also tried to start a couple of different businesses. I tried to start a childcare business because my kids at the time were both under 7. And then so an in-home childcare business. And I'd also tried to start a tech startup because by nature of being in the Valley, my CTO from a previous organization that I worked with and one of my clients from one of the big tech companies in the area at the time, we got together 3 Black founders and came up with a really cool idea for a personal CRM. And this is prior to the mobile app economy, right? But it was really innovative and, to be honest, still a pretty cool idea that we came up with. And we tried to get into these different incubators and accelerators, and we knew all the things to do. We'd seen it done before. We were in the ecosystem. But at that time, this is around 2008, 2009, I started to really pay attention that there was nothing but older white men running those organizations, and there was nothing but younger white men coming into those organizations. And I started to realize something's wrong, right? And additionally, after being laid off, I had also tried to get into the ecosystem from a workforce development standpoint. I understood that, okay, maybe if I work at a big tech company, that I'll have some other opportunities and exposure. But I was being told by some of the biggest tech companies that we know to this day at the time that they did not hire HBCU grads. They were considered, they ranked them at that time, they ranked them differently than PWI schools, and also that it wasn't a good culture fit. I wasn't wise enough and far enough in my career to file any sort of discrimination. And Twitter wasn't around at the time to just get online and put on blast. So I had what I call my legally blonde moment, where I just got so pissed off because I was just thinking, you know what, like I can't win. There's nothing that I can do. So, and my last layoff, by the way, happened on the first inauguration day of Barack Obama and Barack Obama's inauguration. And so it was, January 2009, the company that I worked for said, hey, we're not going to, it's mandatory that you can't take that day off of work. And then, so this historic day that I really wanted to go to DC and take my two kids to go and be a part of, we couldn't go and participate. Then to be laid off that day amongst, 2,000 plus other employees across the country because of the recession, anger doesn't even really capture the feeling, right? But it also was a bunch, I felt very hopeless too, because I thought, okay, I can't have a job doing and something that I'm really good at. Like, didn't matter how good I am at my job, didn't matter, what, how much you try to bootstrap yourself. There wasn't even a glass ceiling, right? It was like a cement ceiling. And I really decided at that point, and I didn't know anything about policy or had ever thought that I would get in the public sector. I just really took this leap of faith, took my severance package, decided to get into telecommunications policy, because at that time, which ended up being the early days of tech policy, because tech policy wasn't a thing yet. So I moved from the Bay Area with my two kids and got into telecommunications policy with the thought that I wanted to talk about women and minority participation in the innovation economy, but really around like from a entrepreneurial and ownership perspective / workforce development. And at the time, The Hill was really talking a lot about digital divide, which clearly is still an issue. But when you're thinking about in 2009, the work that I was talking about at that time was a bit more cutting edge and ended up being foundational work for a lot of the conversations that we have today.
See, that's an amazing story. How did you, if you can just, you kind of described it, but how exactly did you feel when, you were told that you couldn't take that day off at work, if you can put it into words?
Sure. I think, well, initially, like any good employee, I thought, okay, well, there's some reason I can't do it. And I mean, I really didn't think a whole lot about it before the layoffs, but it was the very first time that I ever was laid off. I had companies, the two other times that happened before then, one company went bankrupt, that I had worked, that had been a big company for a long time, but just didn't survive. And then another was a nonprofit that also had some major layoffs because of a loss of funding, but it was different, right, than a corporation laying you off. And it was, and quite frankly, the people that they laid off, it was predominantly women and minorities across the country. So that level of anger, enough to take a complete leap of faith. I had no idea. It also, I remember the day that I got laid off, walking out on the streets of San Francisco, and it was like a ghost town because so many people were being laid off with companies across the city, the economy, just because of the nature of, this is kind of the tail end of the first .com boom and kind of like the rise of the next wave, the second wave, as they call it. And I felt like, well, and I'll reference it again, actually the movie Robots, because in the movie Robots, it's about how older robots become obsolete and how they, that the new kind of companies coming up at that time start making all these robot parts to, outmode the older robots. And so if you can't afford these new parts, then you don't exist in the new economy. And then you end up, getting shipped off and melted down to new parts. And I felt that exact feeling, like that's what was happening to me. And I needed to quickly, like many, even entrepreneurs do, you have to really pivot. And so it made me become now what I consider myself as is not just an entrepreneur, but an entrepreneur. How do I take those skills and put them into organizations, into government, into others, with that mindset to help change the thinking.
See, and that's a lot of what you're doing right now. So can you tell us a little bit about, your role at Women Venture, and what is Women Venture?
Sure. And I'll just say that to Glenn, who's in the chat, absolutely. I talk a lot about that. That layoff was one of the biggest blessings. And I'm so thankful for it now, because if that hadn't happened, and if I wasn't forced to do that, and it gave me a severance to do it, right? It wasn't a big severance. I had only been with that organization 6 months, but it forced me to step into my life's work and my purpose. And so at Women Venture, I just joined as the CEO. Women Venture is a SBA designated Women's Business Center, and it's also a CDFI. And so for those who are not familiar with CDFIs, that's a community development financial institution. That means we give microloans. We're like a mini bank, but just, a bit socially conscious around our lending. But we do a lot of other really great work. And the previous CEO had been here for some time and retired. And what also happened in her final time here in the organization is that COVID hit. And then all of a sudden, this is an organization that has to jump to virtual. And so all of our classes went online, and we started as an organization realizing we were national. We're based in the Twin Cities and Minneapolis, Minnesota, which also at the same time ground zero for the civil unrest that's happening across the country. And really, with the trials and even the recent shooting here. So there's a lot of conversations happening nationally that put this, our region in a national spotlight. And so it's a really good opportunity for me to bring my background and subject matter expertise to, especially around women and women of color. And, so when you think about COVID, it's impacted women in greater numbers than our male counterparts, because so many women have had to leave the workforce to school from home, and also just loss of jobs and a number of other things. So there are so many women that are looking for alternative forms of income. So I actually wasn't planning on being back in the Twin Cities myself at this time. I was in the process of moving, interestingly enough, back to the Bay Area after being gone for almost for a decade. And then came here only temporarily to really help out with my parents, and realized that this was never, this was not ending anytime soon. And so the opportunity that came up, and this is, speaking of blessings, that's how I look at it as a woman of faith. I really started to say, okay, wow, what are when I first started looking at entrepreneurship, when in my 20s, I quit not my first job. I quit a job to start my first company, which was a marketing communications firm at that time, and thus became also a tech company. There weren't resources in the Twin Cities that matched where I was. So now Women Venture existed at that time, but it wasn't accessible because of the cost of the training for entrepreneurship. And there were a lot of other, and it also wasn't welcoming. It wasn't really necessarily an inclusive space. And you're talking about 20 plus years ago, but I'm not going to date myself. So the point of it is that when I came back here to help my parents during COVID, but before everything was completely shut down, I did visit the office there to volunteer, because I felt like, I had noticed there were some significant changes that had happened through the years with the organization. And I thought, this is, how perfect is this that I can help volunteer somewhere and give back to, supporting women entrepreneurs. And then who would have thought, within that year, the CEO would also retire. And so it just was like, and I think with also my work with economic development and what was happening here in the Twin Cities, I'm just a firm believer in everything happens for a reason. And it felt like the stars were really aligning, like my purpose-driven work was needed in this community right now to do this work and help, not just with, because part of, what being with Women Venture does, it allows me to have a very credible and well-established organization that's almost 50 years old, and have that as a platform to also speak on behalf of those who don't have a voice.
Sure. That's amazing work. With the current environment where you're at, has that affected your work at all in any way?
Absolutely. So, I mean, as one of my staff members pointed out a couple of weeks ago after the shooting of Dante Wright, and I have staff members who live down, like right where it happened, and the National Guard was already deployed here for the Chauvin trial. So, a number of my staff members. Now, we have been let me back up to say this, we've been remote as an organization fully, not just in our training, but as a staff since March of last year. So it has, and so because of that, we're actually in the process of giving up our office because we realize like there's probably no going back there. We're going to shift into a co-working space as things start to open up. But my staff, like we literally had to, have a lot of internal meetings to address how our staff was feeling. And some said that, it felt like they lived in a war zone because there were National Guard deployed all over. It's also, my own personal trauma and PTSD. I'm, a mother of two Black teenage sons. So to see someone get shot who looks like, my kids and seeing the fear that he had in those moments and, just all of it is very triggering. And then in addition to everything that's happening, with the protests and so forth, and not just the protesters, right? You have also a number of people who feel are in opposition to the verdict and so forth, and who are trying to antagonize communities of color. It's a really unfortunate time where, as a region, but even as a country, that we're seeing such division happen when we're just talking about basic human rights.
Right.
But what I will say is that for us, those that live here, every day for over a week after Dante's shooting was our phones would go off with that Amber Alert sound. And that was, as you know, is a very loud noise, and then sometimes you might even be on the phone at said time, and that to go off in your ear,
right.
Signaling curfew, because we had curfew during that time. It's been a tough several weeks.
Yeah. See. So just kind of transition a little bit. You're currently pursuing your PhD, right? And that's a big goal, and you're already established CEO. What makes you decide to go back to school to, get your PhD?
So in theory, I'm still doing my PhD because I started this prior to obviously this role, but my move I did start it while I was in the mayor's office. And then I have so many years to complete it. And at the time, I actually had to put it on hold because of, it wasn't a virtual program. But it's interesting, right? Because COVID has happened now. And so all these schools are like refiguring like their terms and so forth. But it's actually a good question that you're asking, is like, why even pursue a PhD at this point? Well, it's off the basic principle that that you often find with women and minorities, where we have to be that much more validated in our thinking and our professional experience and our degrees in order to be, not even to get the same jobs, right? Just to get like to even be considered, which I find utterly ridiculous, because you're absolutely right. I don't, and you're thinking of like, why even do it? No, I don't need a PhD. Let's be really clear about that. And as you can imagine, PhDs, not to discredit in any way, the academy and just, the scholarly work, but it is usually steeped in theory versus in practice, right? And so it was really a tough choice to even decide to do it, but I felt like it was needed to continue to show growth, because I was hitting, again, ceilings, even after all of my body of work being proven. It's interesting how many people have gone on to make careers off of my work because they were my, advisors or directors or whatever, right? Even in economic development, because as we know, economic development and philanthropy and and government, all that can just be just as bad as the private sector, if not worse, for women and minorities, right? And so you'd have to ask yourself, why has it been so hard for me to, and I will say this, because part of what I was trying to do was really get into venture capital. And now there are these pushes to diversify venture capital. But when this started for me, even 5+ years ago, with the work that I was doing, I started to pivot from just trying to support entrepreneurs and create resources. And then I realized, okay, you can give them all the resources that you want, but if they don't have access to capital, then, how do we, looking at the numbers? So, and there's so many different studies on it, but let's just use like CB Insights quote on the amount of venture capital that goes to women and minorities, right? And it's up. It used to be 3% collectively for women and minorities. It's up to about 8% now. Well, that's still nothing, right? and the billions of dollars that are spent in venture capital. So I realized I wanted to start attacking that number. And the way to do that is, get to know that those business models, get in and networking. And it's still very hard to break into it, because if you get close to money, what do you get close to? You also get close to power. And there's a reason why there has yet to be a shift in that space.
I see. So when you say you were trying to get into venture, you were trying to get into like an actual firm to make sure that minority, entrepreneurs were receiving the capital that they needed, right?
Probably, around 5 years ago, that was probably my approach.
Yeah. Okay.
I think I've changed, but I think it's just like, this is where the entrepreneur and piece comes in, and the entrepreneurial piece comes in, is I just try to get around obstacles. So whatever that is, if that means, if it's getting into a VC firm, or if it is getting into, I'd also started to look at a number of large foundations that were starting to support entrepreneurs more. That has also been extremely difficult. And there's only so many. I mean, there's starting to be more foundations and others that are focused on, seeing how entrepreneurship can be, very powerful economic drivers. But just trying to get in, or even jumping back into the tech space, right? And saying, let me work, because there's a number of programs that are starting in tech companies, not just around diversity in recruitment efforts, but social impact efforts and things like that. And it's still been very difficult, because now the new thing that's against me is ageism, because now companies want somebody that looks, like the rest of their workforce and is young, they can pay them less. Because now the other reversing that has happened is, I'm almost too smart for my own good, because I've out degreed myself. I have too much experience, and it's a lot harder. And there's a whole conversation that happens around, the older workforce and more mature workforce.
See, kind of to go back to something that you said, because I'm taking not something that you said specifically, something that you said triggered this. I'm taking a triple E class, entrepreneurship class, currently here at Syracuse, and we're learning a lot about bootstrapping. And in my class, professor talks a lot about bootstrapping and, getting access to capital through friends and family and things along those lines. But as you may know, individuals, Black and brown minorities, they may not have friends who can give them a loan, or they may not have, be able to get a credit card. What are your thoughts on bootstrapping just as a whole?
I think that it's, bootstrapping is a very privileged concept. That's what I think. You're absolutely right. Not only about whether or not you have friends and family. When you hear the stories of every founder, the fact that they could jump out of college earlier, the fact that they could, somebody's, dad gave them $1 million to play with. I mean, that's privilege, right? Additionally, I think there's an assumption in depending on what community you're from, because it's not this across the board minority communities, but in certain Black and brown communities, entrepreneurship is not actually seen as, it's not a respected profession. I think that's the other thing that people need to realize, for a lot of families, if you're the first one to go to college, the expectation is you're going to college, we're going to invest in you so that you can then go get a big job and then give back. And so many people, when you see Black and brown people in the private sector, they are holding down extended family. They are doing a lot in extended community, right? And so if you were to leave that to pursue something that's considered risky, it is actually perceived negatively around being high risk, being crazy, right? And, like, why would you do that? And it's considered selfish and so forth, versus being supported in the potential of creating really the only way that you will ever create real generational wealth. If you're working for other companies, you're helping that company with its bottom line, but you're not owning it, right? There's only so much stock you can get. There's only so much that you'll get out of it, so much return on investment, right? And so it's an antiquated model. But then on top of it, when you're thinking about minorities who are already largely in debt to just get that degree in the first place. So like I have a 18-year-old now who is, graduating from high school, next month. And, we literally just sat down last night to confirm which school he's going to. So shout out to Morehouse College. He's going to Morehouse. Yeah. And so, but he, really was hesitant because he was like, I don't want, like, how am I going to pay for this? How am I going to pay for this? And then I'm going to have this debt on me for the rest of my life that will prevent me from doing these things. And he was so worried. Right. And and it's very real for people of color around paying for education. So there's just not the luxury and not the community support to be an entrepreneur. And being an entrepreneur in general, I don't care who you are, can be a very lonely path anyway, because not a lot of people understand what you're doing, what you're trying to do, and what it really takes.
What's that? So in your bio, it says that you worked with, startups and incubators. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience working with, those type of organizations or
groups? So everything from, DC government was the first investor into 1776 out of DC, which is a tech incubator, or was, it's evolving into a bunch of things now, but at the time in 2013, I think, when we invested to help it get off the ground and start up. But I did something there that I think has really served me well throughout the years, which is I started doing weekly office hours. And it was a little unconventional, of course, for government to sit, but I wanted to watch our investment in this organization, but I also wanted to make us accessible, so that I had like basically a weekly focus group of hearing what entrepreneurs' issues were, were they getting the things that they needed? It was so popular because it was literally packed every time I came on that Friday, that they built it out into a whole program. So a whole big office hours program for mentors to come in and sit and just talk, entrepreneurs could sign up for time. But that continued and all I was doing was connecting resources and connecting them to things, or, offering to, something that can be just as powerful, and in some cases more powerful than financial capital, social capital.
Right.
So worked with 1776 during that time. Also, or shortly thereafter, Halcyon formed, which Halcyon is a incubator for, well, they have an arts incubator, but they also have an incubator for social entrepreneurs, and so have been on their selection committee and doing advisory work for them since they opened. Black female founders, up until last year, also held BFF Labs, which was a pre-accelerator program to help BFFs, or Black female founders, to get into other programs, and being in pipeline, like essentially any organization I've been with, or whether it's even through my role in economic development, it's about really just connecting dots in the ecosystem and helping kind of pull those resources together and then be an advocate and activist in that way. But then also for entrepreneurs, I do have some startups that are specifically, paid to be my clients to help walk them through a lot of the things. Because the interesting thing is a lot of programs that exist don't match the timeline of the entrepreneur. And I don't care which entrepreneur it is, every entrepreneur needs customized help, right? So there's certain things that you can go through a bunch of business plan classes, you can go into a bunch of programs, but at a certain point, there's certain subject matter expertise that you really need. Now, a lot of entrepreneurs should, although they don't take advantage of this, should really just build up a really awesome team around them as far as what are called advisors. It's the first very easy thing that you can do as an entrepreneur is have an advisory board. But a lot of people don't make that ask. But anyway, so I serve on a lot of advisory boards for different startups and different entrepreneurs. And just because I know what it's like to be them, and wishing there was somebody who cared enough that it wasn't just about getting paid, that could help me navigate the ecosystem.
You kind of mentioned it in the last question I asked about, being an entrepreneur, it can be lonely just because, not everyone is on the same page and they don't understand what you're going through. But specifically, what are some challenges that you faced as a, Black entrepreneur and a woman as well?
Well, I mean, the first thing that happens, and I think people forget that it's not how great your idea is. It's about whether or not, when people are investing in you, whether it's your first client or whether it's venture capital, they're investing in you, not your idea and not the business. They or service, right? They want to know that you're the person that can execute this particular thing or this business idea. And so having people not believe in me because I'm not somebody that they're comfortable with has been extremely disturbing through the years, because no matter how much proof I have and what I'm capable of and what I've done, and it's funny, it even shows up in the work, on a professional level. I mean, there's been interviews that I've had where people say, "You've done all this?" Like questioning it, like there's no way you could have done this work. You're not capable of that. So being, as you hear, the common term now is being underestimated is very frustrating.
Do you think diversity is important in tech and entrepreneurship? And if so, why?
Absolutely. It's super critical because what we've seen in a lot of spaces and places is how much when you lack having diversity around a table, critical thinking is lost, right? And it ultimately does negatively impact the bottom line. Great example that I heard a long time ago in the car industry, they were talking about how many deaths were happening to women and children because a lot of the safety features and things that were created did not think about it from that perspective, right? So, and so how important it is just to have, whenever you're innovating, having others' perspectives. But to me, diversity, inclusion, and equity, really isn't just about gender and race, which is often what people think about. It's so many things, right? It is about age, and I talked about that just a moment ago, but it also is about socioeconomic. It is about ability. One of the things that I thought was so interesting, speaking of advising and supporting, is during my role in DC, one of the things that where I really grew and experienced my perspective of privilege is that Gallaudet University is based in DC, of course, so which is a university for deaf students and for the deaf community. And so therefore, by just by proximity, DC has one of the largest deaf populations, right? And because of that, there's a huge deaf entrepreneurial ecosystem, and often individuals who are challenged with ability have to be entrepreneurial because it's harder for them to get jobs. And getting to know that community in particular and how they would welcome me to different events, and they would talk about their issues from that the community would talk about their issues from the standpoint of, like, we can't even go to startup events, or we can't even go to incubators and accelerators because there's no translator, right? We have to pay for that. We have to. So there was one individual, he was in I think a master's program, or maybe I think he was in a master's program at Gallaudet. And so he had a translator with him, paid through school, but the second he was going to graduate, so this was this ticking time bomb for him. But just even with physical abilities, I started to really get involved in a lot of the entrepreneurial meetups and organizations from different communities. to realize like there's so many things that we take for granted. Like, are our physical spaces, allowing those with varying abilities to access that space? Do we think about, so I'm talking about the deaf community, but translation services is a huge issue in general, right? We are not thinking in including, and then here's the other thing that happens. We make these decisions that we think we're being so inclusive, but we're making decisions for people without including them in really the collaborative thinking to solve for the problem. So then we often have misses as organizations, because you can't, there's so many times that I have been at meetings, and often may have been the only woman or the only minority, and there'll be a conversation around, well, how do we solve, diversity in venture capital? Well, maybe you would start by inviting people to this conversation. Like, can we just start with the simple things? But you'd be surprised how many, people say, well, we have a space and nobody comes to it. But have you ever created relationships and invited, because you're thinking about the way that you communicate and you're thinking about your networks. So then you're continuing to hire people just that, or let people know about a resource because they're people that and that you feel comfortable with. But do you know how hard it is to come into an intimidating, to come into a space where there's nobody that looks like there's nobody that says hello to you? I mean, when I think about in the late 90s and the early 2000s, because my first career originally was in national advertising, and being the little rookie at the time, I had a lot of .com companies as my clients, because they didn't think they were real companies. So they'd send me to go work with them. That's actually how I got involved in tech, by the way. But I would go to these events, and there were, again, no women and no minorities, but I was going there to just better understand their businesses, and there were pitch events and all of these different things. And not one person speaks to you. And as a matter of fact, if you come up to a group and you try to engage and talk, they literally act like you're not even there, or people assume that you're the help. Or, I mean, just, it's so disrespectful and degrading. So I know what it's like to be that individual, to go into an unwelcoming space. And, and it's the little things, right? It's, people think it's like, well, we communicated that everybody is welcome. But, if I look at your website and I don't see anybody of color or anybody in varying ages or anybody that, any sort of diversity, I'm going to make it gives me nonverbal cues that this is not a welcoming space, that didn't even take the time to think about being open and reflective of who you're trying to serve.
For sure. Well put. I have about 2 more questions. So you're well established, you have so much experience, but looking back, so knowing what you know now, is there anything that you would do differently?
Well, hindsight is always 2020, but not really, because at the end of the day, I made the right decisions at the time with the resources that were available to me. If I had the resources that youth have today, I think I'd be a very different entrepreneur. I also wish that, it's one of those things, it's almost like being like Da Vinci, right? Mm-hmm. Not to like give myself Da Vinci level credit, but what I mean by that is like, when you're just ahead of your time, it's like, I missed that window, because all the things that I was talking about and then are now the things that are like, oh, like, this is a topic now, but I'm, 10 and 20 years too ahead of that conversation, that it doesn't, so now there's so many organizations that are looking for minority founders, and having a hard time finding them and trying to connect. So, but then if I were to come in as a founder, again, because we still have so much ageism in this space, which is interesting, right? Because it's not even just about color. I think this is just an interesting concept around ageism, because actually the most successful entrepreneurs are, and studies show, start businesses in their 40s, right? They've had experience, or 40 and above, right? Because they've had experience, that they're bringing their subject matter expertise from the private sector into building a business. But that is the least place that it's resourced for individuals. So then they're leaning more on their personal wealth and their assets to get a loan or whatever, what have you. But again, then we flip to the socioeconomic side where not everyone has that, right? If you've been supporting your extended family, you haven't really created much, you probably don't have that many assets. You probably don't have that much generational wealth. And I won't go down the statistics between the wealth in the average, white family versus the average Black and brown family.
Thank you, Erin. So now I wanted to open up the floor for any questions that you may have for Erin based on what she just presented. I know it's a small group of us, so it should be, pretty easy to answer the questions. So
I'll go. Hi, Erin.
Hi.
I'm Amy from Center State, and I'm just so in awe of your story and all the ways that you've really found to serve the community and develop yourself and just keep going. I'm curious about the venture capital world. I don't really understand that world. And I'm curious, you talked a little bit about some of those dynamics. Can you kind of paint a picture of what you saw there? Kind of, how does it really function? I don't know, what are some of the opportunities that you were able to, like just being in that world or wandering around that world for so long, where do you see it going and like opening up in the way that you might hope?
Yeah, my hope is that there'll start to be more accessible programs to train individuals to go into venture capital. Right now, if you look at like the Kauffman Fellows program, it's very hard to get into. You have to be referred, and it's a considerable amount of funding. And so of course it's pretty high because it's usually a professional development effort that's paid for by other VC firms to train up their employees. But when you think about that, if you were just to Google programs that teach you to be a venture capital, it's very limited, right? There's not that many. And the ones that do exist, even 500 Startups has a VC Unlocked, which is interesting because they call it VC Unlocked, but it also is very inaccessible. And it's a bit of a, referral in program. But when you look at the programs that exist that create that to get more, and so they're just starting. I mean, literally in the last couple of years, there's now an HBCU VC to try to train, but that's targeting students to go into venture capital as like a workforce development effort. So what you see is a lot of opulence, right? And a lot of disconnect from the real world of entrepreneurship. But it's also interesting because, one of the things for entrepreneurs is that you don't actually want venture capital, initially, right? You want to keep as much equity in your company as possible, but it is this ivory tower that exists. So, I think that there are a number of opportunities still to diversify that space, diversify the types of businesses that are invested in. And when you think about it, there's the other issue is that there's kind of this elitism around it, right? But most of these individuals who are in venture capital, yes, there are some investment bankers and others who have come from a finance background, but honestly, a lot of the people there are not. It's been a good old boys network for a very, very, very long time. So that's what I'm seeing. And I know that Glenn had a couple of questions in the chat. So he was asking, when someone is questioning your credentials, how do you maintain your composure? I can't admit, Glenn, honestly, that I've always kept my composure, but most of it I have. And what I've used it as an opportunity to do is just know that that's not the right place for me. If I have to, I think initially I used to try to explain and defend. And I really, I think as I got more into my career, that just meant that that wasn't the right place for me. But I think what I've tried to do is take those experiences and be transparent about my experience in my storytelling, and use my voice as an opportunity to really shed light on the environment that exists in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And then he was also asking, interviewers have been really condescending, especially depending on, another broken system that I will say, and this is from a workforce development standpoint, is that actually has not been really dealt with, I think, to the level that it needs to, is the HR space, right? And so, because that's the first line of defense, and those are gatekeepers. You often have individuals who are in that space. And I remember I was just on it wasn't even a panel. I think it was actually like a community conversation with some leaders. They were talking about it from an HR perspective. I'm trying to remember what the panel was about, or the discussion was about. But anyway, the person was saying that just in the last, I know what it was. It was as a part of the Twin Cities United Way, the board was actually going through a training, diversity training on, I don't know if anybody's read this book, Black Fatigue, by Dr. Winters. And Dr. Winters has an amazing national firm that does diversity and inclusion training. But somebody on that call on the board was talking about how a white female colleague of hers just admitted to her recently that and she feels horrible about it now, but for many years, she would remove resumes from the pile from anyone who went to a Black college or had a name that identified in any way of a person as a person of color, and she was taught to do that. And so they were talking about how, as a friend with this person, that they were explaining, like, do you understand the impact of, that exclusion, and how many people, how many families you impacted by not even giving them an opportunity to be considered? But it sounds like it's an antiquated practice, but it really isn't. And it still happens actually to this day. And these automated systems that exist are just the new forms of doing that, right? But when we look at our job description, it's actually from that conversation, one thing that I thought was really interesting, it was saying what's something that you can do today to change HR practices, to create a culture around it. And one thing that I thought was interesting is Dr. Winters had mentioned that one client of hers is actually putting as a requirement in their job descriptions is exhibiting anti-racist behavior, and like just kind of like, like making it, like letting it be known in the job description, which is great on an external front. And I think I thought it was pretty bold, and I really like that. And I mean, she didn't give us the exact language, I'm just paraphrasing. But the other thing though is that when you look at that area of an industry and how there's still so it's funny that the HR teams of organizations are leading diversity initiatives, but those tend to be the least diverse departments in companies still to this day.
Well, Erin, this is Kevin Schwab. Thank you, by the way, for being here. And you threw me off my game a little bit with that last one, because I'm sitting here going, wow, we know it happens, but to hear someone say that, yes, I did this, and yes, I was taught to do this, that's just stunning. I would hope that pretty much everywhere now that's a fireable offense. My question was actually going in a different direction, because I love the intersection of the things that you have done in your career as they relate to startups and engaging women and people of color and finance and tech. If you are trying to build a more equitable tech ecosystem, so you could retire the hashtag TechSoWhite, in a city, what are the elements that you would be putting in place? You've worked in the incubation space, you've worked in the coaching space, you've worked in the finance space. What do you see as the mix to say, now we've created the environment to hopefully welcome, to nurture, and to help accelerate these startups that are coming from women or that are coming from people of color that have been, frankly, that have had such a hard time breaking in the tech space.
So is your question, once I've done all of those things, or how do I start that process?
Now, what in perfect world, you're starting with a clean sheet of paper. What are the things that you would say you need to do this as a community, and or as an incubator, or putting yourself in a position to say, I want to assemble the assets where I have built the right environment to basically swim against that tide and be a place that produces successful tech startups that's inviting to women and minorities.
Right. I think, and so I'm going to kind of talk about it, like, what are the things that I first do? And then also kind of the perfect world that I see, like what I'm trying to create with the work that I do. So the very first thing that I do, and I'm doing this even now with Women Venture, is I'm changing who's at the table. If you go to Women Venture's website right now, we're predominantly white female organization from our board on down to our staff. So that is in the process of changing as we speak. So, because we can't have, and that diversity includes, now this is a situation where it's like, where are the men? Like, we can't just be an organization full of women and women on the board and leave out some important conversations, because actually, even though we're Women Venture, at the end of the day, we can't discriminate either. So we give loans to anyone, it doesn't matter, which a lot of people don't know, right? So I think just no matter what role, wherever I am in the ecosystem, the first thing that I do is really address who's around the table and forming those decisions. But in a perfect world, when I look and I say, well, or when I feel like my work is done, right, I think is kind of where how I'm interpreting your question, is that when there is, the ecosystem truly is inclusive and equitable. When we talk about venture capital, and when we can look at how much is being invested in different companies, and that is like, oh, that, that's actually fair. There's this percentage, it's 50-50 men and women. It's pretty substantial numbers that match our population of our country, and even so, just by, to me, whether it is in staffing, whether it is in funding, whether it's in who's participating in these programs, when it reflects the communities that they receive, and often, whether if it's a company, if it reflects the customer base that it serves in the population, if it is an organization, the taxpayer base that is paying for these resources, right? All of those things, when we're reflective of the communities that we claim to serve, and people, and also, therefore, we have, and we've also created generational wealth in communities, Black and Brown communities, or where women, even who can be independently have financial freedom as well, then we'll be in a position where I feel like, my life's work is done.
That's a great question, Kevin. Thank you for answering that, Erin. Do you have time for a couple more questions? I want to be mindful of your time. So if anyone has any more questions, just let me know and I can, ask her. You can come off mute and ask her.
Erin, I just wanted to ask a quick question. Hi, my name is Megan Durso. I'm with Center State, and joined Center State almost, 18 months ago on that site. And I came from the HR world and the HR consulting. And you're so right about just the insane HR practices and different elements on that side. And it's still really scary on that side. But I guess my question for you would be, with venture capitalists and all these different startups and things like that, if they were going to focus on that certain elements of HR, what would you recommend?
I'll just give you three, because there's a lot that I would change, right? But just the first three, again, are one, changing the who's at the table, making the decisions around those conversations. I think even as Glenn put in the chat, really taking a more thorough look in the language. I mean, I think job descriptions are like one of the worst pieces of writing ever. Often nobody takes time. People are just reinventing other things and copy and pasting, but not really. We're just moving too fast that we're not really taking the time to authentically really ask the right questions around informing those job descriptions, right? And I think, the other thing is the third thing is these have to be real commitments, because at the end of the day, these are all reflections of leadership. If leadership doesn't think it's a priority, if leadership hasn't changed it, and this can't be one of those situations. And this is where over, the past 10 to 20 years with the issues around diversity, it's been solved with white women. It can't be solved with white women. That's not solving the problem whatsoever. And as we've learned, white women can be just as much, perpetuating white supremacist practices as anyone else. And this isn't an attack to say that all white men and all white women are supporting white supremacist, infrastructures. But if you're standing there and you're not saying anything and you're not doing anything about it, you are a part of the problem. So those would be the top 3 things that I would recommend.
I would like to say, Erin, thank you for coming and spending your evening with us. For me personally, this was truly inspiring, just seeing you, become a CEO and all the amazing work that you're doing, and to be working in this field and this, this space is really inspiring to see that this is something that is obtainable for individuals like myself. So thank you for coming in and sharing all of this information with all of us. Thank you everyone who attended, and we'll see you at the next speaker series event.
And thank you so much for having me. It's been great working with you all over the past several months. So I really appreciate the time again to have this conversation, and happy to join again if there's an opportunity to help and inform your work.
Thank you, Erin. Appreciate it.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.